So in this webinar, we'll be discussing new research by the Social Biobehavioral Research Group that transforms how we think about the determinants of arts and cultural engagement. The work synthesizes a large amount of underlying research into a new interdisciplinary framework, which the team have called RADIANCE, and let me congratulate you on a fantastic acronym. It's a culmination of 2 years' work that I believe has been funded by the British Academy. So I'm joined today by the researchers behind this work. I've already mentioned Daisy. Daisy Fancourt is professor of psychobiology and epidemiology, and also the head of the Social Biobehavioral Research Group at UCL. And I'm joined by Dr. Katie Waring, who's currently a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Daisy and Katie have led the development of the new RADIANCE framework, which conceptualizes, I believe, more than 30 determinants of arts and cultural engagement within a dynamic multi-level system. So just a tiny little bit about today's webinar before I hand over to Daisy. In today's session, we'll first hear from Daisy, who will give an overview of the framework, and then Katie, who will talk about how the RADIANCE framework can be applied in actual practice. And in doing so, we're going to explore the barriers people may face to engage with arts and culture and the action we can all collectively take to address those barriers. And then at the end, we'll have some time for discussion. So I'm inviting you to submit any questions that you might have about the presentations using the Zoom Q&A function. You can also ask questions in the chat, but it'll help us keep things together if you try to use the Q&A function. And we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. But for now, I'll leave it at that, and I'll hand over to Daisy. Daisy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nils, and it is such a pleasure to be presenting this work to you today. As you heard, I am the head of the Social Biobehavioral Research Group at UCL, and our focus is on understanding the role that social behaviours and connections have on our health, including social deficits like loneliness and isolation, as well as social assets, which includes arts and cultural engagement. And we do this via a wide range of programmes, including clinical trials, epidemiology, mechanistic, biological and behavioural studies, and also the building of new theory. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. One of our big passions within the research group is understanding the impact that the arts have on us. And as you heard from Nils, over the last few years, we've been working extensively with WHO, looking at the relationship between arts and health. So whilst the arts, of course, have many different intrinsic and extrinsic benefits, in the WHO report, we specifically looked at the findings from 3,500 studies that had looked at the relationship between arts and health, both for prevention and promotion of health generally, as well as for the management and treatment of specific illnesses. And ultimately, what this has led us to is arguing that the arts are a health behaviour, just like diet and physical activity and sleep, for example. But the grim truth around this is that arts engagement is profoundly unequal. So despite arts engagement being ubiquitous across every culture throughout human history, in modern society, it's unevenly distributed demographically, socioeconomically, geographically, and politically. And working with WHO and with the Jameel Arts and Health Lab with WHO recently, we've been undertaking work for a Lancet Commission on Arts and Health, where we've been mapping rates of arts engagement around the world. This is still work in progress, but as you can see, even from this initial map, there are huge differences in how much people report engaging in different types of arts and cultural activities. And when we actually start to look at why this is, in other words, what are the predictors of people's engagement, what we find is a pretty concerning pattern. We find that people who've got lower levels of education and lower levels of income are less likely to engage in the arts. In other words, the arts engagement is typically centred amongst the wealthiest and most educated parts of the population. And in fact, even at a country level, we find that countries that have higher levels of inequalities in them have more arts engagement, because the arts engagement of the more affluent within society is driven upwards, and therefore the difference between the highest and the lowest levels of engagement is even greater. And just these analyses were looking at a global level, so analysing data from 64 countries. But even if we break this down by continents on this rough map that I've created, you can see it's the same pattern in every continent. So inequalities based on factors like education and wealth. And we've previously shown that this is completely true for what's happening in the UK specifically as well. But at the same time, we have statements like this from the United Nations arguing that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community and enjoy the arts. This is the United Nations human right. And the majority of UN member states have formally accepted this as a responsibility. They've put it into international treaties. It's even been given legal status in international law in some countries. But whilst we look at other UN human rights and we hold them to public scrutiny, we monitor them, we look at our records and try and improve, we're not applying the same scrutiny to this UN human right. And the real problem is that given we know there are benefits of the arts for public health, as well as other societal outcomes, inequalities in access to the arts could be exacerbating health and social inequalities. So this means that ensuring equal access to the arts isn't just of relevance to the arts and cultural sector, but also to lots of other sectors, including public health, education, and other public services. And it was this problem that drove the whole conception of this project. We decided to ask, what are the determinants of arts and cultural engagement, and how can they be optimized? In other words, what are the factors that act as barriers or facilitators to people's engagement? And 2 years ago, the British Academy provided funding through a mid-career research fellowship for me to explore this question, working with colleagues. And I want to present to you what we've found from the last 2 years of that work. So we know that arts and cultural engagement is a complex human behaviour that has multiple different dimensions relating to the way we engage, the types of art we engage with, and the people that we engage with. And there are lots of studies that have shown that there are individual levels to barriers of engagement. Things, for example, like age, education, socioeconomic status, where we live, for example. And this has led to so-called downstream solutions to try and increase and diversify audiences. So we've seen, for example, arts organisations altering their communication strategies, changing their pricing, running outreach programmes. And this is fantastic work that's being carried out. But when we zoom out to national levels, what's interesting is that actually, even if there have been local benefits at national levels, there really hasn't been a huge amount of change in attendance rates or the equity of attendance across countries over the last couple of decades. And this suggests that we have to be thinking about things a little bit differently if we really want to improve rates of engagement and equity of that engagement. Now, there actually has been quite a lot of research that's looked at other kinds of factors that can act as barriers from lots of different disciplines of research. The problem is lots of this has happened in silos. So what's happened in psychology hasn't necessarily been known about by what's been happening in economics or within ecology, for example. So what we've really lacked is a proper comprehensive model and understanding of what these barriers are that helps to explain why inequalities exist and how they can be overcome. So this is what we set out to do in our project, RADIANCE, to construct an interdisciplinary theoretical framework looking at what do we already know and how can we make use of it in a better and clearer way to guide future policy and practice. So our approach to this was to look at this from various different scientific lenses. In particular, there were 3 theories that we drew on scientifically. So ecological systems theory is a theory that proposes that we have to think about the dynamic interconnections and interrelations between individuals, their communities, and their environments. Eco-social theory then argues that we have to see people and their behaviours as driven by that environment around them. It's a related concept, thinking about that individual and their context together. And complex adaptive systems science is one that we've worked with a lot over the last few years to think about the arts. We've used it to understand the ingredients in arts activities and the mechanisms that they can activate. And it helps us to think about the world as a dynamic system that changes over time. And that's how we have to think about people's arts engagement as well. So in the project, we started by doing an extensive scoping review where we looked at what research has been done about barriers to arts engagements. We then convened a disciplinary expert steering group of 11 academics from lots of different sectors who then provided us with further input into theories and factors we could be considering. And then we gradually brought all of this together into a new framework, which we called RADIANCE. As Nils said, we're very proud of this acronym, but it says it's the framework of the determinants of arts and cultural engagement. And we're hoping, if it's not too cheesy, that this will shine a light on what the barriers are to access to the arts and culture. So I'm going to show you what this framework is. It's got a lot in it. And so I'm going to give you a kind of overview of it and a couple of examples, and then point to lots of resources. The real aim of this webinar is to be able to show you where you can follow up and learn a lot more about this. And Katie's going to take you through a more specific example case study of how it can be applied as well. So this is the overall image, the model that we've come up with on RADIANCE. And as you can see, arts engagement sits at the middle of a series of concentric circles. In total, there are 35 different factors that we identified as important determinants of arts and cultural engagement, which are shown in the green circles here. And broadly, the whole thing is split into different levels. The microsystem is the immediate environment that a person lives in, so your day-to-day interactions and the features of you as an individual. The mesosystem is a system of microsystems, so it's things like your school environment, your home environment. The exosystem then just takes you one notch further outwards, so the neighborhood that you live in, for example. And then the macrosystem starts to think about the social structures that we're all a part of. And the chronosystem thinks about how things change over our lifetimes. And as you can see as well, this figure is also split into 3 sections, looking at social, tangible, and intangible. So social features, which are the ones shown here, are where the primary features are to do with the interactions between people. The intangible ones are things that might have a virtual or imaginary basis. And the tangible ones are to do with physical assets or resources that we have within our society. So what we've done is for each of these different factors, we provided definitions of these so that you can see how we think these factors affect arts engagement and how they also interact with one another. And we've created an interactive tool online on our website, which is provided here, which means you can click on each of the green nodes and see the definitions for how that factor affects arts engagement. Crucially, as you'll have seen, we've not proposed like different arrows between all of these different green nodes because that would provide a very unvisual visual, we decided, but also because these things are highly complex. And I'm going to come back and talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I want to provide a just sort of example of what we mean by this. So what does this actually look like in terms of enhancing our understanding about how the arts, what the barriers are to arts engagement? So I want to use one example, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that COVID had a dramatic effect on people's arts engagement. Now, at the heart of it, COVID was a public health issue. So you can see here this blue node. That really was the main factor that we see as influencing arts engagement. But that's far too simplistic to really understand it. What RADIANCE as a whole framework highlights is how the effects of this single public health issue reverberated across the ecosystem, leading to so many other factors actually being affected that essentially limited people's arts engagement. So, for example, there was a social change that was caused by lockdowns, drastically affecting people's social behaviours. But at the same time, there were some opportunities. For example, we saw that the virtual environment suddenly became a lot more popular as a way for people to engage. There were also other tangible factors, for example, arts and cultural organisations as part of the creative and cultural industries being dramatically affected, having to close and not being able to show performances. We also saw things in the education industry, such as the closure of schools, which reduced children's arts engagement at schools. And the pandemic also affected other factors like economic systems, affecting public funding that was available to arts, and also affecting the finances then of freelancers. So essentially what you can see from this image is that the public health issue affected arts via knock-on effects on so many other different factors. And this provides, for the first time, a way that we can actually visualize what that looked like, what those different factors were, and why it was such a complex picture for understanding what happened to people's arts engagement. As another case study example, I wanted to talk about the Sing Up programme from the UK, which was run from 2007 to 2011. This is much more of a positive story here, but supported by the Music Manifesto. It was a national singing programme that aimed to raise the status of singing and increase opportunities for school children throughout the country to sing as part of their everyday lives. The programme was really successful in reaching young people, so about 95% of state primary schools engaged by 2011. And again, Radiance gives us a way of thinking about why it was so successful. So again, looking at arts engagement in the middle of this, we can see that the programme focused on enhancing engagement in schools, which are part of public services delivered via the educational industry. But specifically, it really focused on transforming that entire education industry. It wasn't focusing on one school at a time, but it was looking up at that macro level, at a very high level approach to trying to change behaviours. It also specifically targeted children's capabilities, their opportunities and their motivations to sing through embedding learning, play and confidence building in the activities that were rolled out as part of it. And one of the key things that it did was target the virtual environments through providing lots of online resources through a major online bank. It also used other really interesting approaches to try and enable singing, like using influencers to promote the programme. There was even a national singing ambassador. And there were lots of partnerships with arts and cultural organisations and also widespread media campaigns. Also, by taking a national approach and trying to get every single primary school to become a singing school, it was trying to change norms and values around singing and trying to reduce social inequalities by making sure that all children had the opportunity. One of the crucial factors that got it off the ground was the buy-in of government, so politics coming into play and the ring fencing of public funding for it. And all of this was positioned as trying to make singing part of England's national identity. But actually, it's also really interesting to think about the Sing Up programme as a case study, because despite its success and the strongly networked way that you can see it was designed, trying to target so many different barriers and enablers at once, the programme was really scaled down a lot after 2011. And this was because of a change in government, so politics, leading to the withdrawal of public funding. So that's also really key here to show that even a programme that addressed lots and lots of different factors at once to try and bring about a change in behaviour, and did so very successfully, it was actually in the end really changed because of changes in just one or two specific nodes or factors, highlighting that even widespread approaches can be vulnerable if one or two nodes are particularly influential. But I want to think more about some of the key considerations about using Radiance and what it teaches us about arts behaviours. So overall, the framework proposes that individuals' arts and cultural engagement is determined by a large number of interconnected factors that operate at different levels of influence. So this really challenges some of the previous approaches that have tried to address arts engagement barriers at micro levels. We're not proposing here that this is just about someone's age or their gender or their ethnicity as to why they aren't engaging. We're explaining that this is actually a really complex, interconnected ecosystem that we have to be understanding. Another important thing to recognise is that the proximity of those factors within those concentric circles doesn't necessarily imply that the ones closer to the individual have a stronger influence than the ones that are further away. So just as an example here, the closure of local libraries would be a meso-level factor, but this would have a profound and immediate day-to-day effects on individuals who use those factors. So we have to think not just about the proximity or how quickly things are felt, but think about how important each factor could be to an individual. A third thing to recognise is that an individual's experience, all individuals' experiences will be unique. So even if you had two people with very, very similar barriers to arts engagement, even twins, let's say, living in the same household, they could still have really different experiences of these barriers depending on specific micro-level factors. Even things like their personality, for example. This could determine how these individuals adapted to the barriers that they were facing. So this doesn't suggest a kind of simplistic formula that it will always mean that people's behaviours change in an expected way. Also, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about seeing what these factors are, but thinking about the interrelations between the factors. As I said, we haven't illustrated this visually because it really does depend on the specific context, and it's also something that needs more work. But I think this is really important to bear in mind. So large-scale changes, for example, like entire new cultural policies, they might have very little impact at an individual level if the flow of interactions that comes from them isn't carefully thought through. Whereas, like I said, with local libraries closing, that could be something that would have very clear effects, because that's a factor that could immediately impact on a person's day-to-day behaviours. So if we want to improve arts access, then what can we learn from what Radiance is telling us? I think the first thing is that we have to rethink our focus on demographics. Over the last decade or so, we're always talking about individual characteristics, where the arts engagement is equal across demographic factors. But actually what we're arguing in the Radiance framework is it's not these demographic factors themselves that influence engagement. Rather, these influence other nodes or factors in the model, like capabilities, opportunities, and motivations. And this is a really important shift in our thinking, because we can't really change a lot of the demographic factors about a person, but it is modifiable for us to help change those capabilities, opportunities, and motivations. And in fact, this brings me to my second point. We can apply behavioural science to think about how we can do this. Some of you may be familiar with the behaviour change wheel, which is a behavioural science approach that shows how capabilities, opportunities, and motivations can be tackled. Just as an example, we know that psychological capabilities, so whether you feel like you know how to go and do an arts activity or have the kind of skills to do it, those can be addressed. Those barriers can be addressed through things like educational initiatives, like providing information about local activities, or training, like providing workshops or taster sessions to develop people's skills. Similarly, someone's motivations to engage, we know that good ways of addressing this is through enablement, so making activities affordable or free, or modelling, so running public campaigns showing people engaging the activity. Some of these will draw in other nodes or factors that we've shown on Radiance as well, so like educational initiatives and training could involve arts and cultural organisations or public services like school, while modelling could involve media or influencers. So it's a way that we can address things like capabilities, which are a micro-level individual factor, but by drawing on the resources and abilities and knowledge of other factors in the Radiance diagram. And similarly, we can think about even larger, like macro-level factors like policy changes as ways of addressing some of these individual capabilities, opportunities, and motivations as well. A further point is that we may have to, that trying to change arts engagement is complex. So if we only intervene on one individual factor in isolation, we're quite unlikely to have any impacts in a meaningful or long-lasting way. So we have to really think about addressing multiple different barriers at once if we're going to do that. And I hope that Radiance gives us a visual way of thinking about this. And Katie's going to talk about this a bit more shortly. And as a fourth point, we recommend that the work doesn't just fall to individual arts and cultural engagement art organisations to try and improve access or equity of access to arts and culture. Naturally, artists and arts and cultural organisations have a role in this, but it's unfair to expect that they would solely be the ones that can tackle inequalities in engagement. And as we can see from Radiance, there are so many other stakeholders who have a really important role to play in this. And a final point is that we definitely need more monitoring of rates of arts engagement, but also specifically the kinds of barriers and enablers of this. We have had some of this in the past, things in the UK like the previously named Taking Part survey, but sometimes the way that we've looked at barriers in this is, again, just focused on more individual factors, asking about people whether they felt they were interested in engaging, for example, or things like local transport or funding available to engage. Whereas we really need to be thinking about monitoring the other kinds of barriers that can influence people's engagement levels. And this would be a really helpful way for us to actually start monitoring our own progress in this in a more comprehensive way. And moving back again to thinking about that UN human rights, it would also mean that we could start to track our progress against that, as could other countries as well. So we'd be able to use this as a framework to try and improve equity longer term. So we're currently in the process of writing a further publication where we're talking about the implications of Radiance for improving research as well. So, for example, as a way of helping less biased recruitment into clinical trials involving the arts, helping to uncover less heard voices within qualitative research, and also identify confounders better within epidemiological research. So that paper will be out shortly. But overall, we hope that Radiance could be applied empirically in future research to improve equity of access to arts engagement and mean that we really can try and uphold that rights-based approach that was set out by the United Nations to make sure that everyone who wants to engage in the arts can. I just want to share a slide now showing the resources that we've made available from this. We will be making the video of this webinar publicly available on our website, where we've got a page set up on the project. We also have a full journal article, which is now available online through the journal Welcome Open Research. And we've done a short, just a couple of page evidence brief, where we've just summarized this in more lay language, just to explain what RADIANCE is, so that people can understand it more. We've also got a short animation, which I believe you're going to be seeing shortly from Katie, explaining what it is. And there's also the interactive tool that I mentioned, where you can click on all of the different nodes and see the definitions that we've come up with. I just want to finish by thanking the people who've been involved in this work, particularly our expert disciplinary committee who've supported with all of this. And now I'm going to hand over to Katie, who is going to talk about how we can apply the RADIANCE framework in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Just one moment whilst I share my screen. So yes, I've been absolutely delighted to work on this framework with Daisy, and I'm going to be talking about applying the RADIANCE framework. So firstly, it's important to ask, why might it be important to apply RADIANCE? Why might it be useful to us? And to answer this question, we can start by looking at the broader policy context of arts and culture. So while there are many ways in which improving access to arts and culture is discussed in policy, so for example, improving participation, engagement, or improving reach, what is really clear is that improving access is high up on the policy agenda, and this is locally, nationally, and internationally. And the way in which access and barriers are defined and discussed in policy has implications, so for funding and how arts and cultural organisations deliver and report on their access initiatives. So some examples from the policy literature are on the screen here. So there's language such as being diverse, open and accessible, where every one of us has access, being available and accessible to all, and where different people have access to cultural facilities. And this spans across the World Health Organization, Arts Council England, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Arts, Health and Wellbeing, UNESCO, and there are many, many more. And framed within this policy landscape, there may also be motivations, so at individual, group or organisational levels that intersect with these policy ideas and aims around improving access. And these structural factors and individual and group factors will all inform one another towards this aim of seeking to improving access. Now, those working in arts and culture are therefore often required to demonstrate how they're improving access. This could be, for example, as part of evaluations or for other reasons. This ask may be from funders, arts organisational leaders, or other individuals or partners, but it often involves reporting, so on aims and successes relating to access. And this may involve talking about this in a range of different ways, for example, equity via engagement or participation, reducing barriers or improving access, as we've seen, equality, diversity and inclusion, or equal opportunities monitoring, or improving reach. But again, no matter what the language is, what is really clear is that demonstrating what those working in arts and culture are doing to improve access is so important to sustainability in the sector. However, research has shown that there's a failure to change patterns of cultural participation. And despite this failure, a large body of evaluation reports celebrate the success of participatory projects. So there really appears to be somewhat of a gridlock, whereby not much is changing in relation to improving access and engagement levels, despite those working in the sector focusing a lot of energy on improving access. So how can RADIANCE help with this? Well, as we've seen from Daisy, one of the key ways in which it can help is to move the focus away solely from individual or unique organisational contexts, whereby the responsibility to improve access is really heavily weighted on individual practice. RADIANCE helps us to explore and acknowledge multiple social levels that come into play. Now, as Daisy said, many people in the arts seek to improve diversity, and this happens a lot from arts and cultural organisations or artists, and they put this as part of many policy agendas and things like that. But RADIANCE posits that it's not demographics themselves per se that influence engagement. As we saw, this is interconnected with individuals' capabilities, opportunities, and motivations, and patterns of social stratification. So there's this need to focus on other factors and factors that are in the indirect pathways, such as social stratification, rather than on individual characteristics themselves. Now, here's an example to think through that may speak to some of you here from arts and cultural organisations specifically. Now, since the 1980s, there's been a growing focus in cultural policy and in arts organisational practice on audience development. This is sometimes called different things, so it could be audience participation or audience engagement, but the focus is generally on broadening audiences or including different types of people in audiences in our artistic products. Now, many audience development initiatives have focused primarily on factors that sit within those micro and exo levels that we saw of the RADIANCE framework that Daisy shared. And this means focusing on things like marketing, reducing ticket sale prices, focus on commissioning and programming. But what we're seeing is that many of these initiatives have limited successes to actually bring in new audiences. So why is this? What else might be going on that affects whether or not individuals engage with such initiatives? So I'm going to share a video with you, as Daisy said, which talks more about this example. It does begin with a brief overview of the framework, but it will then move on to the example, which we're going to unpack further after the video.
People in every culture around the world engage in the arts, but this engagement is uneven. Some people engage more than others. Why? In our new framework, RADIANCE, we've identified more than 30 reasons at different levels, from the individual to the societal. To increase equity in access to the arts, we need to consider all these factors and how they interact. For example, previous initiatives have reduced ticket prices to arts experiences. However, even if people have free tickets, they may face other barriers, like not enough leisure time, no friends to go with, poor public transport, or they may feel like it's not the cultural norm for them to attend. RADIANCE helps us conceptualise these different barriers and plan how to overcome them. To learn more about our new framework and our wider research on arts and health, visit www.sbbresearch.org.
So let's delve a bit further into this. So we know that individual characteristics will of course play a role in engagement, and that micro-level financial circumstances will influence whether someone can afford to buy tickets for certain arts engagements. But these are also deeply interconnected to macro-level economic systems such as employment patterns and social change such as economic uncertainty and politics, which often isn't given as much of a focus when it comes to thinking about organisational strategies. And then if we also think about economic systems, these things are affected by the governments and the money that they have available to fund the arts, so through public funding, thereby meaning that arts organisations may have to operate on commercial models or rely on other funding streams such as philanthropists. And this may potentially change priorities away from social justice models of audience development and focus on increasing ticket sales, may mean programming less risky arts experiences that reach out to safe audiences, potentially creating barriers to diversifying audiences. And changes to ticketing may also fail to take into account other financial issues. So this could be attending if free tickets are given, such as public transport affecting that, especially given environmental changes such as climate change that could affect values around alternative transport, such as driving if public transport is not available. Now, often if somebody was developing an audience development initiative, they may not necessarily be thinking about all these other factors. So when we think about applying this, we can think about being reflexive of all these different other elements of our model. Now, this is just an example of potential scenarios, but you can see that all of these factors may come together to influence whether or not one will engage in the arts, and also whether or not an audience development initiative may be successful. And we encourage you to use RADIANCE to explore your own context. So this is your own questions, your own individual circumstances, and which different factors may come into play to affect arts engagement in the environments in which you're working. So we encourage you to firstly access the online visual of the framework and explore the definitions of the factors and which ones may be relevant to your context. So you briefly saw this on Daisy's screen, but this is an interactive version of the model that we've shared with you, and you can click through and look at the different definitions of the factors that we've outlined. You can then download or print a blank version of the framework and use this as a reflexive tool. So as I have just done, you can think through those different factors and look at how they might interact in the specific environments and contexts or questions in which you're working with. And you can discuss these with colleagues. You can also consider engaging in some desk research to explore how your work may intersect with broader factors, such as societal and policy changes. And you may want to do this in conjunction with other tools that help you to think beyond the context. So, for example, a SWOT analysis or a PESTLE, which is very common in organizational practice. And you can then use the framework to visually map out how different factors interconnect in your context, thereby influencing engagement. And we also really encourage you to explore which factors are modifiable. So what do you actually have influence over in this model? And if you do have influence, can you use something like behavior change models to think about how you can have that influence to encourage people to engage with the arts? And at this stage, you may need to think very carefully about who to collaborate with. If there are factors in the model that you can't modify, maybe there are others you can reach out to find more, to understand more, and work together to influence these factors to encourage people to engage. So I very much hope that that inspires you to use Radiance, and thank you very much for listening. And I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Rachel, who's going to help us with a bit of an interactive Mentimeter activity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie. I will share my screen. So just before we move back to Nils and onto the Q&A section, we've got 3 quick questions that we would love to ask you to gauge a bit about who is in the room and also your thoughts on this research. So we'll be doing this through Mentimeter. So if you're happy to, please load this up, and you can do that by going to the link, menti.com, and entering the code that's on the screen. Or you can scan the QR code. You can do this on a phone or a laptop. And I can see some thumbs up floating, so that's great news that people are able to get onto it. I think my colleague is also posting links in the chat as well. So I'll give people a moment just to get set up on that. Super. I'll move on to the question then, but the link can still be found in the chat if you need it, or it's here at the top of this slide as well. But our first question is, what type of organisation do you work in? So you should be able to select from the options we've got on the screen here, whether you're coming from higher education, perhaps funding, policy, arts or community organisations, a freelance artist. You might be multiple of these, in which case you could check a few boxes. If you're something else, something other, feel free to tell us about it in the chat as well. We'd be curious to know who you are and how you're joining today. But great to see all these results coming through. Definitely lots of higher education representation here, but a good mix I can see. Thanks everyone for taking part. And I think it's reassuring as well that we've got so many different people here because of, I guess, people feeling strongly about the issue of equity in the arts and kind of appetite for change. So I think this is really positive to see the split across. I'll move on to the next question now. So we're curious to hear how you think you might use the Radiance framework in your own work. So we've got a few different options here, which you can have a read through. So if you agree that you might use Radiance in a particular way, you should be able to click and add a kind of dot to the pile. So we've got different options you can see. Maybe it's reflecting on what barriers audiences may face when engaging in arts and culture. But there's also some more specific options. Perhaps you work in an organisation and you might be developing your own policies or practices. Maybe it will help you with monitoring and reporting on access for either yourself or funders. Maybe you will be doing your own research or evaluation into barriers and enablers of arts. Or maybe, again, it's something else. And we'd be curious if you're happy to share in the chat if you have another way that you might think Radiance would be useful. Great. Lots of people rethinking barriers and conducting their own research, which is really interesting. Super. And I'll move on now to our last question, which is asking you about which of the resources you might plan to look into further. So Daisy and Katie mentioned a few. We've got our scientific paper, the full paper with all the details, also a shorter summary of the paper. We've got our animation, which you've seen, but maybe you would share with people that you think might be curious to learn more. We've got the interactive map as well. Our website project page rounds up all of the resources, and we'll also be sharing this recording. So just to reiterate, these kind of useful links will be sent to you via email after the webinar, and we really encourage you to delve deeper and reflect on some of the points that have been made. the interactive map is doing particularly well. So that's great. I think you can really take from that what you want and apply it to your own projects that you're involved in personally or professionally. Super. So I think I will end this segment here. Thank you so much for everyone who participated in it. And we will go back to Nils, who can facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Rachel, Katie, Daisy. That was a fantastic set of presentations. Super interesting, and also already generating quite a lot of questions in the Q&A session. So we only have about 15 minutes to try and answer some of these questions. I do encourage you to add more if you think of some. But I do want to get cracking. So often these conversations start with definitions, and I don't want us to get too bogged down in definitions. But we have had a few questions in the Q&A, and I guess I would add one myself. And so the question, like, can you say just a little bit around how you define access and engagement? Does this relate to formalized or structured opportunities, or also embedded cultural activities? Like, for example, if people are church going and regularly sing at church services, would that be captured in the research that you've done? So how do you define access and engagement? And then maybe also a little bit about how you define culture and or cultural and arts activities that you're looking at. So I don't know who wants to start first. Maybe Daisy, we start with you.
Thanks, Nils. So we're taking a really broad and inclusive definition here of arts engagement. So that, as you saw on one of my early slides, I spoke about the different modes and the context and the people involved and the different art forms. We're including any kind of activity that people are doing, whether it's directly participating in the arts, either at home or in community settings or in other settings, or people who are perhaps attending in a more receptive way arts experiences. We're thinking about things that will include people's own creative practices as well as professional opportunities to engage in the arts. So we think this has got a relevance across all those different kinds of experiences.
Thanks very much. Katie, do you want to add to that?
I think only that I would add from a methodological perspective, we did draw on our expert advisory group. So you saw that long list of names who helped us to sort of define this together. And so we drew on so many different expertise across a whole range of disciplines. So we were trying to really have a multi-dimensional perspective on these definitions and draw on all kinds of disciplines. And that was also the case for the literature review. So when we were searching for literature, we had a long list of different types of art forms, both informal and formal, and that was used as we did our literature review. And then on the perspective of defining access, we were very much thinking about barriers and enablers, drawing on the COM-B model, which is the capabilities, opportunities and motivations model, amongst other models within behavioral science and behavioral change and implementation science. And these terms are already quite tightly defined in those contexts. And I think it was more, how does that map onto the policy discourse? So within behavioral science, we're talking about barriers and enablers, but within a policy context, people are thinking more about access, participation, and engagement. So again, it was having that very interdisciplinary approach and trying to combine these things together to understand how different people from different backgrounds and different contexts might use this framework.
Thank you. And just maybe to stay on this for one more moment, because we have a kind of concrete question in the Q&A. It seems like the main focus though is on arts engagement without a therapeutic intent per se. So not creative art therapy. Is that right?
We were looking at this as part of arts engagement broadly. That said, I do think that Radiance has a relevance to thinking about clinical programs as well. If we're thinking, for example, about an arts therapy project or an arts-based program within hospitals or within communities that's aiming to improve health outcomes, that's still something where we need to ensure that people can attend. And we know that there are still inequalities in terms of who's more likely to take up referrals to these kinds of activities, or still challenges that people may face, barriers that may make it harder for them to sustain their engagement. So I think the tool can still be really useful for thinking about those environments as well.
Thanks. Another question, or another couple of kind of related questions are around the kind of systematic inequalities that might exist, and And I guess there's a question somewhere that nobody's completely asked that, but I'm kind of I'm creating that question out of these series of questions. Is there a hierarchy of barriers? I mean, I know you're in your framework, you're trying to encourage people to think a bit more holistically and not just think about things around financial or pragmatic barriers like that. But I mean, for instance, one colleague in the chat has asked, well, what do you do if there just aren't many services around to begin with? And it seems like that there are some barriers that are really quite systemic and fundamental. But perhaps there isn't much value in kind of creating a hierarchy of barriers.
I think if we were saying like there are like why are there not any services available, I'd be saying, well, why? Like what are the reasons there are? Is it that there's not enough funding, or there isn't the expertise to set the services up, or that there aren't the pathways for them to link through to social care or healthcare or whatever? Or is it not seen as politically important? Like that, there must be reasons why those services don't exist. So I think that this, Radiance is a tool that could help to identify what those are. I think in terms of hierarchy, it's really challenging because, as I was saying in my presentation, there are some factors that are really close to individuals and others that are really far away from them on the diagram. But that doesn't mean that some of them have more or less influence on people's day-to-day behaviours. And I use the example of some sort of far removed policy changes versus like closing a library. Those are both macro level factors that seem quite far removed from an individual. Closing a library could immediately stop whether someone can go to that library the next day, whereas a policy change may or may not have that influence as directly on somebody. It may trickle down to them via other factors in the diagram. So I think we have to be careful about saying that some factors are more important or less important than others. I think it's really a case of thinking about those interconnections and the cascade of effects that they can catalyze. There are certainly some that are harder to change than others. And I think that's the big issue of thinking if something seems really intractable, can we get around it by addressing lots of the other factors in the diagram and see if it's a workaround? Or do we really have to pool resources from the other factors to try and tackle that one intractable factor?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that that makes a lot of sense, and I guess goes to the heart of this tool, which is a tool to help map the factors and understand the factors that are at play. But at the same time, can you say a little bit through the research that you've done? Perhaps you've come across some examples of good practice that have addressed some of these barriers more holistically or more collectively, where you can kind of maybe drawn some insights from or highlight, or is that not, again, is that perhaps a bit difficult to do, to share some examples of good practice?
I think the Sing Up program, which Daisy talked about, is a really excellent example. And I don't want to like band over to you, Daisy, but I think you probably know more about that program than I do. But I think that the key thing with that program, that it was very much about working within the education system. So for anyone who's not aware of that, it was a large scale program that rolled out singing into schools. And that's a really excellent example of doing something at a systems level. So it's not just about a kind of local choir with a small company. It was very much about rolling this up and addressing barriers in education. But I don't know if you have anything further there to add, Daisy, about the Sing Up as a good example.
I think there's probably lots of examples of the local level practice more than the national, but actually one of the things that we're trying to do at the moment is to look for those national examples of things where macro level factors have been addressed with good levels of success. I think one example we could think of as well is something like social prescribing that's gone from kind of 0 to 60 as being a service in the UK, and that's happening in lots of other countries as well, as trying to increase people's access, not just to arts, of course, but to other kinds of activities in communities as well. That's in some sense, there's been a success story because it's suddenly taken a whole new service. It's provided lots of enablement and ways that people can access. But at the same time, I think everyone's aware that there are still a lot of challenges and other factors that have not been addressed, which is highlighting the sort of complexity of trying to do large scale change. And I think that being able to visualize that with Radiance could help to articulate and unpick a bit more about where success is and where remaining challenges are.
And I think the key thing is as well that Radiance helps to kind of unearth those tacit factors. So when we're talking about structural and systemic inequalities earlier, we know that those things are hard to change, as you said, Nils, and that can feel quite challenging, or I don't know what to do to move forward. But what this tool can help us to really do is unearth those challenges and think through them and unpack them. And that's one of the key things here that I think is a real success of this model.
Thank you. So I think we only have about 5 minutes. That's probably enough to answer one more question. And from the chat, but also from a couple of other questions that have come in, and perhaps inevitably and invariably, we do end up around a systemic question which involves funding and involves funding opportunities. Now, I'm not expecting either of you to be able to solve that very difficult question in 5 minutes. But I wonder if there's something to be said around, again, learning from other institutions, exchanging information around funding opportunities, not just at the UK level, but also in the European and possibly global level. Are there any, within the scope of the tools and the resources that you provided, is there any information there that you are sharing about philanthropies, for instance, NGOs, groups that are active in the space and interested in collaborating?
I would say there are some really great networks out there for people who want to connect with that. I've actually been really happy seeing all the discussions that have been happening in the chat of people introducing themselves. And on our website, we've got links to and resources for people to find other networks if it is a case of kind of finding peer support essentially and communities of good practice to follow examples from. I do think that we need to have more of that, because addressing barriers to access can be such a challenging thing to do, that where people have had success stories, being able to share those is really important. I think particularly if we're trying to see change at national levels, that's going to be a combination of things that will be national level initiatives, but also the ripple effect of lots of grassroots and smaller efforts gradually building up. So if people want to sign up to our newsletter as well, we could actually in our next issue make sure that we share some more of the networks that we're aware of for people to follow up with.
And hopefully this would also help with funding acquisition. I think one of the things I was talking about in my presentation is that people need to demonstrate how they can improve access to the arts, and that can feel very challenging. And it can also be the case when it comes to evaluation as well, like how do I demonstrate what I've done? And this is a huge challenge that's faced by arts and cultural organisations when they're trying to go for funding, like how will I demonstrate, how will I put together an equalities monitoring plan, those kinds of things. Hopefully this framework will support people to be able to articulate how they will go about trying to improve access to arts and cultural engagement. And that's something that's quite challenging at the moment. There aren't really frameworks to help us to articulate that. So hopefully this would also be an opportunity, whether we do that alone or with others reflexively in the part of networks as Daisy's described, to be able to speak better about this and be able to include that in as a language within funding applications going forward.
Very much, Katie. So we're running out of time. There's one last question that I want to ask, Daisy. You've already posted some links in the chat, and you've told us about how we can find out more about this. But is there anything else that people need to know about how to learn more about this research?
Yes, I can share just a slide again that shows what the key resources that we're providing are, and you'll get an email with this with follow-ups as well. One extra thing to flag is we actually do run an annual Arts Health Research Intensive, which is a 5-day course in which we cover lots of the evidence base around arts and health, the theory that underlies it. It's very practical, thinking about developing research and evaluation projects. And we're going to be building Radiance into that course for next year. So you'll also be able to sort of learn practically how to apply this alongside the other tools we already teach on. So we're going to be opening registrations for that in the next few weeks, but that's all available on our website, including details about how to sign up.
Thanks so much, Daisy. Well, okay, I think we've reached the end of the seminar. I certainly learned a huge amount. Daisy, it was fantastic to hear both you and Katie speak on this topic. And thanks, Rachel, for organizing as well as putting the Mentimeter questions up. But most of all, really, I want to thank all of you for participating in this seminar, in showing up, in asking your questions, and putting your information in the chat. It was really wonderful to meet you all virtually. I hope we all stay connected on this topic and on arts and health in general.